The statues of Confederate war heroes and generals and monuments to the Confederate troops are works of art. Okay? Let me first say, before I get into the whole statue thing, that I don't particularly enjoy being dragged into this ridiculous non-issue that is being pushed by certain political activists for a political reason. I think it is a ridiculous non-issue that most people don't care about. I do think the hatred and animosity towards these works of art is being ginned up artificially for political purposes. I think that's pretty obvious to anyone who follows the news closely and understands what they're reading. So I don't really appreciate being dragged into it. This channel is supposed to be about geek stuff. It's supposed to be about comics. I would like it to be about comics and movies, obscure horror and science fiction and obscure pulp fiction and all sorts of things relating to genre movies and pulp art and comic book art. That's what this channel is supposed to be about. But I already have a manifesto, and I already have my video stating very clearly that I don't believe America is a racist country. Let me just restate for the record that I am a white man, but I've been married to a black woman for 28 years, 29 years this November. I have 2 mixed-race children, and we're still married, and this is my home. This is where my wife and I and our children live, and we live in a very mixed neighborhood. And my kids go to majority minority schools. We go to a majority minority church. In fact, it has a lot of Nigerian immigrants in it. So yes, I am a white guy, but I married into the black community, and I'm stuck with addressing some of these ridiculous things that are foisted on the black community by people for political purposes. A lot of people seem to think that if you just push the right button, if you just grease the right palm and push the right button and say the right buzzword, that you can just lead the black community around like a bunch of sheep. And that is a really insulting and racist viewpoint. But I know a lot of political activists, white political activists, hold that viewpoint. I know a lot of black political activists hold that viewpoint, that they have the power to manipulate the community. I think the black political activists are a lot more realistic about the limits of that power, and I think the white political activists that try to manipulate the black community are frankly a lot more racist. Although I'm not saying that black people can't be racist, because of course everybody can be racist. But don't really appreciate being dragged into this, but I am an artist, okay? You can look up my pen name. I used to work for Fantagraphics. I've worked for multiple independent publishers. I've self-published things that were distributed nationally and internationally. My pen name is Sandez Ray, R-E-Y, like Rey Mysterio, Sandez Ray. I'm actually wearing my Robot Jungle Girl t-shirt. And if you go to Rula Cthulhu, Rula, R-U-L-A-H, Cthulhu spelled the same way Lovecraft spelled it. If you go to rulacthulhu.com, you can actually read tons of comic stories that are complete stories that I've put up there. And I have nothing to sell on the internet. I don't sell this t-shirt. This t-shirt is sold out. I don't sell anything on the internet. I'm not on eBay. I don't have a merchandise section for my YouTube channel. I don't have a merchandise section for rulacthulhu.com. That's strictly a place where you can read some of my stories for free, and you can also read the graphic novel I'm working on at page by page, as I put up new pages every 2 weeks. So you can read it as I'm doing it if you so desire. But there's a lot of complete stories on there too. So as an artist, I feel like I'm being dragged into this thing because it involves art. Because statues are art. Okay, I hope we all understand that. It's not a complicated concept. When you hook a rope to a statue and topple it off its pedestal and pull it to the ground and break it and destroy it, and we've all seen the footage. People did that. When you pull a statue off the pedestal and destroy it, it's no different than going into a museum and throwing a bucket of paint on a painting, or taking a knife and cutting up that canvas. It's no different than walking up to an artist who's sketching, on the boulevard, and tearing the page out of his sketchbook and tearing it up in front of him. It's no different. Maybe a little less personal, but it's no different. It's no different than burning a book. Destroying a statue is burning a book, is tearing up a drawing, is cutting up a painting. It's all the same thing. It's art. You're destroying art. You say you're protesting against white supremacy? It's nonsense, okay? These Confederate statues do not represent white supremacy. That's bullshit. You young people are easily bullshitted because your schools are bad, and because you're taught a lot of nonsense, and because you've heard a lot of politically correct garbage. But I've been around for a while. I'm 57 years old, okay? Just because something has a Confederate flag on it, or is a representation of the Confederacy in some way, it doesn't mean it represents white supremacy. Let's just go to the world of comics. DC has a long-running Western character named Jonah Hex. Jonah Hex is a disfigured former Confederate soldier in the post-Civil War period. Okay, is Jonah Hex a white supremacist comic? Are the writers and artists who worked on Jonah Hex white supremacists? Clint Eastwood was in several westerns where he played ex-Confederates in post-Civil War era. I believe The Outlaw Josie Wales is about an ex-Confederate soldier. Is that a white supremacist movie? You have to really be stupid to think that anything that involves a representation of the Confederacy is white supremacist motivated. Let's say I paint a picture of Robert E. Lee. Not a painter, but let's say I do. Would that be a white supremacist picture? Answer now. Okay. Is a painting of Robert E. Lee a white supremacist painting? Okay, you got your answer? Okay, the painting I just made in my imagination of Robert E. Lee is a painting of Robert E. Lee wearing no pants, in his underwear, in women's underwear, sitting backwards on a horse with a goofy look on his face. Now, if you said that a painting of Robert E. Lee is a white supremacist picture, you would look pretty stupid when I unveiled that picture saying that I was a white supremacist, wouldn't you? Because you can't just look, you have to put something in the context of why it was produced, what the purpose was, the purpose of the painting that I just imaginarily, is that a word? That I just created in my imagination. The purpose of that painting was clearly to mock Robert E. Lee. And you can't say that someone who sets out to mock Robert E. Lee is a supremacist. But furthermore, there's really no evidence that Robert E. Lee was a white supremacist. People if you have any grasp of history, you would understand that prior to the Civil War, most people in America felt that America was a collection of sovereign states, that the states were who you owed your allegiance to. There was not a strong federal government. There was a very limited federal government, limited on purpose by our Constitution. People in that era felt that you owed your allegiance to your state, not to the federal government. And the fact is that Robert E. Lee opposed his home state seceding from the Union. He was against it. But when it happened, he did what he felt was his duty. When he was given the commission of leading this army, he did what he felt was his duty to his home state. And the fact that he did so in no way proves that he was a white supremacist. Now, I'm not saying he wasn't. I'm simply saying that wearing a Confederate uniform is not proof. People wear uniforms for all sorts of reasons. Saying that a man wearing a Confederate uniform who goes to fight for the Confederacy is proof that that man is a white supremacist who supports slavery is like saying that a man who wore the uniform and fought in Vietnam is a person who hates Asians and communists, but not necessarily so. There were people with very left-wing views who didn't particularly dislike communists, who fought in Vietnam. There were people, most of the people that fought in Vietnam, had no prejudice against Asians or Vietnamese people, and in fact, many Asian Americans fought in Vietnam. Okay? And you know, it's an odd historical detail, but there actually were a few black slaves who fought on the side of the Confederacy, or who accompanied their officers to practically to the battlefield. I mean, there was one point in the war where they actually had to tell people, send your manservants and your slaves home that you have accompanying you. I'll tell the officers, because many of these officers had manservants, slaves, who had accompanied them up to a certain point in the Civil War. So things aren't so quite simple as to say that everything that is a representation of the Confederacy is in support of white supremacy. Now let me give you a very good example of this. I'm glancing over to watch the time because I don't want this video to run over. A very good example of what I mean is the Dukes of Hazzard. The Dukes of Hazzard was a TV show in the 1970s. It was based on the popularity of car chase movies. Car chase movies were big in the drive-ins and even in the main theaters. They were big in the 70s. You had movies like Bullitt and The French Connection, which were built around big chase scenes. And you had Burt Reynolds, who started his career doing car chase movies in the drive-ins, and all the American International car chase movies. So the Dukes of Hazzard was basically a knockoff of movies like Eat My Dust and Gone in 60 Seconds, and those movies were 70s movies. You may have seen the remake and thought they were new movies, but the success of White Lightning and Eat My Dust and Gone in 60 Seconds and Gator and Thunder Road, that's a movie from the 40s, but the success of the car chase movies of the 70s led to a show called the Dukes of Hazzard. And the Dukes drove a car called the General, and you can look it up online. The car has a Confederate flag paint job. Okay. I was around in the 70s, and this was not the media environment you have today, where there's a million choices, and some people are watching Amazon, and some people are watching TBS, and some people are watching Netflix, and some people are watching YouTube. It was a totally different ballgame. You had 3 network channels, and if you lived in a big city, you might have a PBS channel, and you might have an independent channel that shows old movies and such. But yeah, here in Minneapolis in the 70s, we had a grand total of, I believe, 5 channels. The 3 networks, a PBS channel, and 1 independent channel that showed like syndicated programming and old movies. Didn't have a lot of choices. Every show that was on a network literally drew millions of people, even if it was failing and it was going to be canceled, because there were only 3 choices. Okay, so the Dukes of Hazzard wasn't failing, it was a hit. It was a hit. It was on for multiple seasons. It was big for a while. It didn't last forever because it was such a formula show. They had the same formula every episode. They had to have a car chase. Here's my point about bringing up the Dukes of Hazzard. In the 1970s, no black person protested the Dukes of Hazzard. No one. I don't believe there was one protest. No white person protested it, because they simply did not perceive a car painted with a Confederate flag motif to be anything to do with white supremacy. That simply was not perceived that way by the public. It wasn't perceived that way by the white public. It wasn't perceived that way by the black public. If you believe that black people were suffering in silence because they were too cowed to come out and protest the Dukes of Hazzard 10 years after the civil rights era peaked, you're crazy. Black people weren't afraid to protest. They weren't cowering in submission of the fear of protesting. The black protests were what the civil rights movement was all about. Black people weren't afraid to protest when Bull Connor, the evil Democrat police chief, used police dogs and batons and fire hoses to break up the protests, okay? They weren't afraid to protest when George Wallace, the Democrat, stood in the schoolhouse door with a baseball bat, threatening to beat up any black kid that went into a white school, okay? Black people weren't afraid to protest when there were actual physical consequences of possibly being arrested or beat up or even killed, okay? So the idea that in the 70s, when these consequences of being beat up, killed, or arrested were largely non-existent at that point, the era of overreacting to protesters was long over by the time the Dukes of Hazzard came on, and there were people still loved to protest. People in the 70s loved to protest, maybe even more than people in the 60s, because there wasn't the danger involved. And you could say the issues in the 70s were somewhat smaller, I think, but there was less danger and there was less conflict about it. Protesting became acceptable in the 70s. So the idea that black people are cowering and afraid to protest is obviously a non-starter. Okay, so what else could explain why black people didn't protest the Dukes of Hazzard? Well, it wasn't fear. Okay, it wasn't ignorance. They didn't, to suggest that black people didn't understand fully what the Confederate flag and the Civil War era were about would be an appallingly racist and wrong statement. Of course black people aren't stupid. Of course they knew what those things were about in the 70s. Why wouldn't they? American history used to be taught in schools. I don't know if they still teach it today, but we all had to learn. White and black kids had to learn about the Civil War in the 60s and 70s, and we probably knew more about it than you young people today know. Okay, so they fully knew what the Confederate flag. So it wasn't fear of protesting. It wasn't ignorance of what the Confederate flag was about. So this may seem like a trivial point, but it's not. Okay, if you believe the Confederate flag is a symbol of white supremacy, then you have to explain why black people in the 60s and 70s, well, I won't say the 60s, I referenced the Dukes of Hazzard, so let's stick with that. You have to explain why black people, when the Dukes of Hazzard hit the air, and it was a hit, and it was heavily merchandised, and toy stores had Dukes of Hazzard matchbox cars and coloring books, and they had Dukes of Hazzard lunch boxes, and they had Dukes of Hazzard t-shirts for the teenagers. When they had all this merchandise, and they had a lot of merchandise, okay, it was the kind of show that sells merchandise. Okay, if you think the Confederate flag is a symbol of white supremacy, then you absolutely need to answer this question. Why didn't black people protest the Dukes of Hazzard in the 70s? Why didn't black people, why didn't white people, why didn't left-wing people protest it? Left-wing people used to look on the show with scorn and considered the people who watched it to be a bunch of, redneck jerks, but they didn't protest it. They weren't offended by it. It was just more evidence to them that TV was a vast wasteland. Okay? So I'll tell you, in case you're stumped, I'll tell you the reason why people didn't protest the Dukes of Hazzard. Because they weren't offended by it. Because the Civil War by the 1970s had been over for about 120 years. More or less. 110 years, let's say, more or less. Okay, so it was a 100-year-old symbol plus, and the meaning of symbols changes over time. The context changes over time. And by the 1970s, the Confederate flag had become a completely meaningless symbol of Southern pride. That's it. That's all it stood for in the 70s. And it didn't even stand for Southern pride for all Southerners. I mean, you're saying, yeah, it didn't stand for blacks. Well, maybe not. I don't know if it did or didn't, but it certainly didn't stand for a certain type of white person either, who felt that shows like that were dumb and beneath them, and that TV was a vast wasteland. But the Confederate flag symbol was a redneck symbol. It was considered a redneck symbol, but it wasn't considered a symbol of racism, and it wasn't considered a symbol of white supremacy. It was considered a symbol of the South. Okay? The Civil War happened, but it happened 110 years earlier. So the wound was closed, and nobody was running around feeling all butthurt and offended if they saw a Confederate flag. In fact, the big corporations that ran the music business, the big record labels in the 1970s, they tried to push something called Southern rock because they had disco, which was popular, but a lot of their old 60s rock acts were running out of steam in the 70s, and they were looking for a trend to replace it. And for a while there, they actually tried to push something that they were calling Southern rock, which was Leonard Skinner, Black Oak Arkansas, Molly Hatchet, what's that guy's name? Willie I can't remember all the people that they were pushing, but they had this collection of groups that they were pushing as Southern rock, hoping that it would be the new trend. And they were very much pushing it with Confederate symbols and other Southern symbols. And they had done marketing on what sort of symbology they should use to market these Southern rockers, and people weren't offended when they market tested Confederate flag symbols to push that whole genre of music. People weren't offended by Confederate flag symbols. You would have, if you in the 1970s, you may not have worn a Confederate flag symbol, but you would. Most people, I think, black and white, most people would have thought that you were some kind of jackass if you said, "I'm offended by that Confederate flag because the South owned slaves." Okay, if you were a black person, you said in 1970, the South owned slaves 100 years ago, and I'm offended by that Confederate flag, people would have laughed at you. Do you understand that? People would have thought that you were a complete jerk, a complete moron, and that includes most black people. Most black people would have thought you were a jerk. It seems strange now because society has changed, but that's true. That's true. And people didn't get as butthurt about things in those days. So, and I don't want this to just be a video of the old man saying, "Oh, when I was a kid, things were better in my day." Because there's more to it than that. People are way too easily offended by these symbols, and people have decided to become offended. They've decided to gin up their offense and to get themselves worked into a lather about these symbols. But these symbols, the meaning of these symbols has changed over time, and now there's a political effort with a lot of money behind it, to cast these symbols as being nothing but white supremacy and racism. And that's a lie. That wasn't what they were about in the Civil War period. It may have been a component of it, but it wasn't all that they were about. It wasn't what they were about. Certainly in the 1970s, we had moved far beyond thinking that they represented that. And I had another point, speaking contemporaneously. I obviously don't have scripts for these rambles, but there was something else very important that I wanted to say about this. Oh, I know what it was. And here it is, the big wrap-up, which I'm going to wrap up in like the next 5 minutes. Once you start judging people from the past, historical figures, by today's standards of morality, that's a cancer that you can't cut out once you start doing it. That is a mess that you can't contain. You can't say, we're going to get rid of all the racist characters from the past, because it can't be done. But even if it could be done, why should racism be privileged over sexism? Think about it. Why should racism be privileged over homophobia? Aren't they all bad? Isn't homophobia bad? Isn't sexism bad? Okay, so there's no reason that once you establish the principle that we're going to judge historical figures based on our modern day morality, there's no way to contain that and limit it to the people that you want to criticize. Now, as a left-wing person who wants to take down statues, I'm not saying you are, I'm just saying if you were, you would probably think that you could contain that and limit it and not take down the statue of Margaret Sanger, who is the founder of Planned Parenthood. But no, if you're going to take down the Confederate generals, you definitely have to take down any statue or placard or memorial to Margaret Sanger. I mean, she was a racist. That's a documented fact. And she started Planned Parenthood to reduce the number of black and brown babies. Okay, this was back when they only did birth control, when abortion was still illegal. She started Planned Parenthood to reduce the number of brown babies, and she was a racist and she was a eugenicist who believed in improving the human race through selective breeding. So let's knock her statue down. Okay, what about, see, we're not going to be able to limit this to white men. Okay, many people would tell you that if you read the articles of Frederick Douglass and W.E.B. Du Bois and other famous black figures from 100 years ago, if you read That's my warning that I have a limited amount of time left on my timer before this video splits. But if you read in deep the actual books and articles written by famous black figures from the pre and post Civil War era from 100 years ago, many of those black people would be considered racist by today's standards because of the sweeping generalizations that they make about black and white people and brown people based on race. Are you gonna, did you know that New York Central Park has a statue of Gertrude Stein in it? Gertrude Stein? Well, we gotta knock that down. Gertrude Stein said that Adolf Hitler deserved the Nobel Peace Prize for getting the Jews out of Europe. Yeah, Gertrude Stein may have been a great feminist, but she was a raving anti-Semite. Okay, so let's knock that statue down. What about Dr. Martin Luther King? Dr. Martin Luther King was a Christian minister. Did you know that he believed that homosexuality was a neurotic condition that should be treated by a psychiatrist? Would it surprise you if I said that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. believed that homosexuality is abnormal? It shouldn't surprise you, because virtually every man his age thought the same thing. In fact, you could go back to, say, 1900. If you go back to 1900, I think every historical character born before 1900 was probably a racist by today's standards. Every historical character born before, say, 1930 was probably a sexist. And every historical figure born before, say, 1950 was probably a homophobe by today's standards. Okay. What about Robert Byrd? Did you know that Robert Byrd, the senator, the Democratic senator who Hillary Clinton said was her mentor, this man loved to have things named after him. There's more than 40 buildings, roads, and bridges in his home state named after Robert Byrd. Well, Robert Byrd was a guy that went out and started his own chapter of the Ku Klux Klan back in the 1940s and recruited 144 new Klans members and made himself the Grand Poobah of his own chapter. I think they call it a Grand Kegel, whatever. But Robert Byrd got into the Ku Klux Klan as a way of getting into democratic politics. Because in the South, you got into the Klan if you wanted to get into politics, because the two were very linked in the 40s and straight through till after the Civil Rights era. Are we going to rename everything named after Robert Byrd? Well, that's one that I would happen to support, because I think Robert Byrd was a contemptible person. But I don't support it because if you're going to tear down Robert Byrd for being a racist, then you have to tear down Gertrude Stein for being an anti-Semite. You have to tear down Charles Dickens, who was another raving anti-Semite. Are we going to tear down all the memorials to Charles Dickens? He was a great writer. But if you read the book Oliver Twist, you discover that there's a character in there called the Jew. His actual name is Fagin. He's a bent, hook-nosed Jewish stereotype who teaches orphans to steal, and then takes the money they steal and feeds them slop and beer, and keeps them in as his little criminal gang of children. This is a Jew who teaches children to steal and then exploits them and keeps the money. Okay, if you've never read Oliver Twist, you may not realize that Charles Dickens is such a raving anti-Semite that he probably refers to Fagin as the Jew more than he refers to him by his name. He's continually referencing Fagin, the Jew, throughout Oliver Twist. So let's tear down every monument and memorial and plaque to Charles Dickens, and for that matter, why not burn all of his books? Or at least we could burn Oliver Twist and burn up Huckleberry Finn. Hell, Huckleberry Finn has a character in it named Nigger Jim. Now, never mind the fact that Nigger Jim is a sympathetic character and that everybody who reads the book loves that character, and that the whole point of including that character is to make a message that's against slavery. Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn felt that Jim should have his freedom, and they try to help him escape slavery. Never mind that there's an anti-slavery, overt storyline to having this character in the book. Never mind that it's anti-slavery. The fact is, this character is called Nigger Jim, so, burn the book, right? Well, there have actually been, that sounds ridiculous, but there have actually been efforts to have the book Huckleberry Finn removed from libraries. including removed from school libraries. Now I've got to wrap this video up because I don't want it to split. This thing splits videos automatically in my camera, and I don't know how to stop it from doing that, and I don't know how to edit them together. But the point is, I have like maybe 1 minute here. The point is that once you start judging characters from the past by today's standards, you are literally erasing history. There is no character born before 1900 who can possibly not be viewed as either a racist, a sexist, a homophobe, or something else, or a xenophobe, or something else that would be unacceptable by today's standards. So if you want to get rid of every author, every artist, every politician, every general, every person who's a famous historical figure from before 1900, if you want to get rid of all the Indian chiefs that made huge generalizations about white people that are clearly racist generalizations based on the fact that they're white, you want to get rid of them? You want to get rid of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. because he's a homophobe? Because by today's standards, he probably would be. Okay? If you have to realize that once you start judging historical figures by today's standards, that it's an uncontrollable cancer on history that has no good result, yields you nothing positive, and only destroys the history. I'm going to close on a joke. In the Soviet Union, they used to say, the future is known. It's the past that keeps changing. We don't want to be the Soviet Union. We don't want to be marching towards in lockstep towards a future that our masters have dictated towards us as they continually rewrite the history of the past to explain why we haven't gotten to utopia yet. The future should be the unknown. The past should be the thing that is unchanged. And our interpretation of it can change, but you don't destroy art, and you don't try and write characters out of the historical narrative or minimize them or badmouth them because they don't live up to today's standards. That's not a way to study history. Imagine if we only read books about historical characters that we approve of by today's standards. They would be very recent history if we were doing that. So, Confederate statues are art. Dukes of Hazzard. Got to explain it. If you think that the Confederate flag is a white supremacist symbol, you have to explain why none of the black people in the 70s were offended, and none of the white people were offended, and none of the concerned parents on the right or left thought there was anything wrong with buying a Dukes of Hazzard lunchbox for their little kid. And finally, don't judge historical characters by the standards of the present. It doesn't work. It's a black hole that you don't want to go down. So I'll see you again soon with some more comic geek stuff. And take care. And